basically any structure which is highly vascular. From there, there is high likelihood for the infection to spread to the meninges and then to the subarachnoid space to the CSF. So, colonization of the nasopharynx, then transport across the epithelial cells in membrane-bound vacuoles. Then there can be two ways. The blood-borne bacteria can reach the interventricular choroid plexus, and the bacteria adhere to cerebral capillary endothelial cells and subsequently migrate through or between the cells, and that is how they enter the CSF. Bacteria are able to multiply rapidly into the CSF because there is no effective host immune response. So these are the ways that the bacteria can enter the CSF through the blood CSF barrier, lymphatic system, meningeal barrier, blood-brain barrier. Also, the phagocytosis of the bacteria is very slow inside the CSF because there are very few white blood cells in the CSF. There is small amount of complement protein and immunoglobulins, and because of the fluid nature of CSF. So this is why the phagocytosis of the bacteria is impaired. I'm moving to my case now, and then we'll carry on the discussion with the case. So this case presents to us in the May of last year when COVID is just coming into our hospitals. So this 67-year-old male, he's a case of diabetes, hypertension, IHD, post PTCA status. He came to hospital with sudden onset headache, fever with chills, multiple episodes of vomiting, and followed by altered sensorium. That is when they got him to a casualty. When he arrived to the casualty, it was seen that he has jerky, involuntary jerky movements of the right upper and lower limb, and they lasted for around 30 seconds. Some primary management was done in the casualty, and on examination, the patient was febrile, he was drowsy, arousable to deep painful stimuli, he was not obeying any commands. The GCS was around E2, M5, E4, a pulse of 112 beats per minute, BP 130/70, a respiratory rate of 28 per minute, and saturations of 99% on room air. On further examinations, his pupils were 2 mm, equal reacting to light. Patient had a right side gaze preference. There was neck stiffness which was present and Koenig's sign was positive. There were no focal neurological deficits and the flexors were plantars. Patient did not give any history of having fever since few days or running nose or any other symptoms previous to the symptoms which he came with us today. So, as we have seen the symptoms and the signs which the patient has presented to us with, there are a few differential diagnoses that came into our mind: meningitis, encephalitis, brain abscess, encephalomyelitis, septic encephalopathy, toxic encephalopathy, metabolic encephalopathy, venous sinus thrombosis, and acute cerebral dysfunction. These are a few differential diagnoses which come to our mind like on the first go of seeing the signs and symptoms of this patient. So here, I think all my colleagues would like to see this slide where we have just mentioned a few things that when a patient comes to us with headache, fever, and how do we go about it? So if there is altered mental status, then we can think about encephalomyelitis, acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, meningoencephalitis, or any mass lesion. If there is no altered mental status, it could be meningitis. And then we would need to rule out papilloedema and go on from here. So basically, if we are thinking that this could be meningoencephalitis, obtain blood cultures and start empirical antibiotic therapy. Then go ahead for imaging, see head CT or MRI because this could be a mass lesion, abscess or tumor. So we need to rule out that first. If there is no mass lesion, there is white matter abnormalities. It could be edema. Focal generalized gray matter abnormalities. It could be encephalitis, and then we need to immediately do blood cultures and lumbar puncture. We will go on and discuss each of this part one by one as we go ahead in our slides.
Dr. Swati, Prashi,
Yes, sir.
Can I just point?
Yes, sure, sir.
Pupils were 2 mm reacting bilaterally, right?
Yes, yes.
So that is pinpoint pupils.
So they were reacting to light.
No, but they were 2 mm is pinpoint, right?
No, sir.
2 mm is pinpoint.
Okay, sir.
Pinpoint. So what one differential would come to you, which is not which is not infectious here? Pinpoint pupils in a person with altered sensorium, and any poisoning you would like to think of here, just at the outset.
Yes, sir. We were thinking about toxic encephalopathy. Opioid poisoning could be one
Yes, opioid.
differential. Yes, sir. Toxic
Opioid,
encephalopathy. Yes.
yes, opioid because pinpoint pupils, but the respiration. Any other poisoning? Organophosphate,
Yes, organophos, opioid poisoning.
yeah,
Yes.
and sometimes antipsychotics. Okay, carry on.
Yes, sir.
I want to make the point that in a comatose patient, if you get very small pupils, pinpoint pupils, think of poisonings also, and it has a very limited differential. Pupils are very important. And
Right.
carry on.
Yes. So as the patient was getting shifted
So
from.
at this point of time, actually, Prachi, I would also like to ask one question. Let's make it more interactive as we go, because it will become a very dull presentation. So
Yes,
when
sir.
we said that you wanted to do a CT brain, so is there any guidance or indication or criteria for doing CT head prior to thinking about a lumbar puncture? Let's assume that we have come back to CNS infection as a high likelihood, apart from all the toxins and metabolic causes. When would you decide about doing a CT brain, and when you would probably not do a CT brain and straight away think about a lumbar puncture?
I think that question anybody can answer from the audience. When is a CT, let's say, not indicated before doing a lumbar puncture? Right, sir? Is that way, Dr.
Yeah, absolutely. And after that, we'll ask our panel. Yeah, sure.
Yes.
You can unmute and answer it.
So, Prachi, you have to answer. We give your answer first, and then Dr. Meenal may give some input, and then we'll proceed from here. Sure.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Yeah, so basically, we need to rule out any mass lesion or abscess.
Prachi, 1 minute. Any in the chat box, sir? And there is anything in the chat box?
Yeah, I'm looking there. So actually, there has been a reply from Dr. Chinmay that yes, any raised ICP would be a cause. If patient has papilledema, we need to do a CT. Any absence of papilledema, so basically, raised ICP is something that everybody accepts. But I would just like to highlight at this point of time that this question, because unnecessary delay in doing a lumbar puncture can really have an impact on the outcome, has been addressed by even IDSA, ECMID, and even a lot of other guidelines which have laid down certain major features apart from the empiric word of raised ICP. I think what is important to look for is the patient immunosuppressed? Is there a background of CNS disease? Are there obvious focal neurological deficits seen? Papilledema, obviously, and the duration of symptoms may also play an important role. So if it is very acute, short-natured, no background of CNS disorder, no immunosuppression, pupils, as you can see, are equal and well-reacting, I think an unnecessary delay can be reasonably well avoided for doing a lumbar puncture by waiting for an imaging. Over to you, Dr. Meenal, if you want to add something, and any of the panelists, please, at this point of time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Neha, go on. Yeah. So seizures is obviously, I think one of the participants has also mentioned this. Yeah. And everything else you have already mentioned, Dr. Ansari. Yeah. Immunocompromised status.
Thank you, Prachi. Let's proceed.
So we went ahead to do a CT brain and chest of this patient, as this patient had come to us in May. So we wanted to rule out COVID also during these times. So we did a CT brain and CT chest. The non-contrast CT brain did not show any abnormality, and the HRCT said just centrilobular branching opacities in the left lower lobe. No specific ground glassing was seen. So the CBC was done. Patient was shifted to the ICU. We got a initial CBC report, which HB was 12 grams per DL, the WBC count of 30,000, normal platelet value. The sodium, potassium were normal. Creatinine was normal. The LFTs were normal. The CRP of 22, the triple H was negative. The blood cultures were sent at this moment. A 2D echo was done, which was normal. Then we moved on to do the lumbar puncture for this patient. So the lumbar puncture was done, and this is the report that we got. The hazy appearance of the CSF, the cells were 4,400 with 86% polymorphonuclear cells, RBC 170, proteins of 70. The CSF sugar was 80 with a parallel sugar of 247, and the gram stain showed plenty of pus cells but no organisms. At this point, I would like to question everybody. I think everybody can just put in their answers. What is the diagnosis they feel at this moment?
Prachi, sir, may I interrupt? Andhari sir, just in two, summarize the findings and the history, because it becomes slightly difficult.
Okay, so the patient has presented to us with fever, sudden onset shivering, and then followed by altered sensorium. We have done a CT brain, which is normal, and then the counts are 30,000. The WBC counts are 30,000. Rest LFTs are normal. The triple H is negative, and we have done a lumbar puncture, which is showing us this study. I think can everybody see the CSF analysis?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is the CSF analysis that we have with us. So everybody can, I think, put in if they have any.
I think, sir, Ansari sir, are you able to see the chat box?
Yeah, I'm seeing. Unfortunately, I'm able to see very slow. So bacterial meningitis is what. Yeah, so I'm not able to see a very kind of fast-moving chat box, but bacterial meningitis has been actually 3 people have responded that. So I completely agree that bacterial meningitis seems to be one of the most likely differentials at this point of time, and we'll try to move on to see what will be the nature and what can probably point toward other possibilities. Prachi, can you elaborate one by one? How will the CSF appear in all other differentials?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'll come to that, sir. But I would just like to point out that at this point of time, this is the treatment we had started for our patient, because it was already an hour. The patient was here. We have undergone the lumbar puncture. So we had given him dexamethasone 8 mg 8 hourly and started him on some enteric antimicrobials, meropenem at the dose of 2 gram 8 hourly, vancomycin 1 gram 12 hourly, and acyclovir 800 mg 8 hourly. And we had started him on an anti-epileptic levetiracetam. So let's move ahead. This is the CSF picture we get in meningitis. So as we can see, the CSF parameters in bacterial, viral, tubercular, and fungal meningitis, the opening pressure, the cell count, cell dominance. So in a bacterial meningitis, the cell count more than 1000 mmq, neutrophilic cell predominance, a glucose low, that is less than 2/3 of serum glucose, and high elevated serum proteins. We can see in viral and tubercular meningitis, the cell count is low, which has a lymphocytic predominance. The CSF glucose is normal in viral meningitis, but low in tubercular meningitis. And the CSF proteins can be normal or elevated. So coming back to our case.
Prachi,
Yes, sir?
ask a question. What is low glucose in CSF?
So less than 2/3 of the parallel random blood sugar of the patient.
Does everybody agree? Is it less than 2/3 or how much is it? Or is it controversial?
Less than 60.
I think we need to make a distinction of what is normal and what is abnormal. They are not necessarily on two ends of the same line. For example, when you say normal platelets are 1.5 lakhs and above, that's fine. But 1 lakh platelets is absolutely fine. You would be comfortable doing neurosurgery even with the 50,000 platelets. What is required for life and what we have are different things. 2 kidneys are normal, 1 kidney is all that we need to live. So please keep that in mind. Adams and Victor, a couple of editions ago, they defined hypoglycemia as less than 40. And the sensitivity of the less than 40 is actually quite good. If it is less than 40, the probability of it not being a bacterial meningitis is actually okay. If it is less than 40, it's a very high probability that it's going to be bacterial meningitis. Once it starts going above 40, the probability starts falling off. And remember, borderline low sugars can happen due to many, many, many different reasons. And when you have so many neutrophils in the CSF, whatever the reason be, your sugars will go down. So it's not the bacteria which are actually eating up your sugar, it's the neutrophils. And therefore, when you have lots of neutrophils, they'll anyway eat up the sugar and they'll go down. So I think you need to be careful. Yes, 2/3 is the rough rule of thumb that, and remember your CSF homeostasis is 2 hours behind your blood sugar. So again, you don't know what the sugar was 2 hours ago. So yeah, 2/3 sounds like a good approximation, but between 40 and 2/3, all bets are off. It could be anything.
Absolutely, sir. That is what I was trying to say. Is 2/3 is probably a little more. Maybe just 40% or just the value of 40. And like sir said, when you take the sample, if the patient starts the dextrose infusion, it makes a difference because the sugar lags behind the change in your serum blood sugar by a few hours, 2 hours or 4 hours. So that should be more in mind. Carry on, please.
So this is the picture we have here. So looking at our CSF findings, now we are moving more towards the picture of bacterial meningitis.
I'm going to come back again and talk to you about your antibiotic choice, but that's
Yes,
a
sir.
little later.
Sure. Yes, sir. We will. So the CSF studies which were done. So these are all the studies which we can do with the CSF at this moment. So the routine gram stain, the gene expert, the lactate, the cultures, BioFire, and ADA. I would like to just speak briefly about each one of them. So the CSF lactate, the normal values are less than 3.5 millimole per liter. So the brain undergoes, they say, anaerobic glycolysis during meningitis, and that results in the lactate production. Elevated values are seen in acute bacterial meningitis. The false positive, they can be false positive in head injury, hypoxic brain injury, neoplasm, and prolonged seizure. So a meta-analysis is reported that the CSF lactate of more than 3.9 had 93% sensitivity and 99% specificity for bacterial meningitis. Also, a serum PCT and CRP level, a higher serum PCT level is very specific for bacterial meningitis, more than CRP. They say.
Yeah, Prachi, one thing I'd like to add,
Yes,
if the patient has already received antibiotics, then the sensitivity and specificity of your CSF lactate for diagnosing bacterial meningitis goes out. So that has to be borne in mind. If he has received antibiotics, then it alters the value. Normally more than 4 is considered suggestive of bacterial meningitis. But if it's received antibiotics, then this value of 4 is not valid. It is actually more useful rather than ruling in bacterial meningitis.
Also, we had done a CSF BioFire for this patient. So this is a PCR-based testing, comprehensive of 14 most common bacterial, viral, and fungal pathogens. The sensitivity and specificity is 90%. We get the result in 1 hour. They just need 0.2 ml of cerebrospinal fluid. So the rapid PCR detection gives us a faster answer for which bacteria or virus do we have, and it decreases the use of antimicrobial therapy.
Sir, Subra sir, can you just tell us about the PCR? Should we only do BioFire or the other ones are also as good? And when should we do them? Should we send them all the time? Can you please enlighten us on the PCR?
So film array is a useful technique. Remember, PCR, it all depends on the performance characteristics. Why do we say that? For example, even film array has its Achilles heel. What they noted was cryptococcal meningitis. Cryptococcus pickup in the film array tends to be a little poor because the standardization was for the load that you see in HIV with cryptomeningitis. So if you have a kidney transplant recipient, a negative film array does not exclude cryptomeningitis because there the load will be very low. Same thing for herpes also, sometimes it can miss. And here's the problem. At least for film array, we know the detailed evaluation and we know where the vulnerabilities are and what the threshold for pickup is. Unfortunately, for many of the homebrew stuff, we don't know what the threshold is and we don't know the performance characteristics. So I'm generally very, very cautious about doing these multiplex PCRs and things like that unless I know the performance characteristics. And you can end up with both false positives and false negatives, because remember, unless the sequence is unique to that particular organism, you can have false positives on something else. And second, if your limit of detection is too high, you can still miss it. So there are quite a few reasons why you should be very, very cautious in doing any PCR-based technique. It's not that it's a bad test, but there's a lot of interpretation that's involved in the post-test scenario. So that's something you should be cautious about.
Thank you, sir. Carry on, Prachi.
So this is the report that we had got, a biofire meningitis encephalitis panel, which was done. So it is showing Streptococcus agalactiae is detected. So what now? So I would like to question everyone that what now? So we have a CSF biofire which has given us Streptococcus agalactiae, and what will be our treatment regimen now? So do we continue the ongoing treatment, which is Dexa, Meropenem, Vancomycin, and acyclovir? We stop this and start ceftriaxone with dexamethasone. We stop the ongoing treatment, start ampicillin, ceftriaxone, vancomycin, and we stop acyclovir and continue rest.
So please put the answers, friends. What A, B, C, D, which one do you want? Under seconds, friends, fast. Your response should be fast.
So there are two answers actually. One says D and one is C. So I think I wish we had some poll meter. Unfortunately, I was locked out in between. But I think we'll move on and ask our panelists what exactly seems to be the better kind of combination of drugs at this point of time. So may I request Subramaniam sir and Dr. Neha to give their opinion?
Talking too much. I'll ask
Locked in,
Neha to take this one.
Dr. Ansari, are you getting locked out and logged in?
Yes, actually, yes.
That's what I saw that. Anyway, please carry on. Dr. Neha Gupta, sir, ma'am, please, your advice.
Neha, you taking this or shall I take this? Okay. I think Neha is probably having some issues. Okay, so group B strep, this is GBS, group B streptococci. It's a known pathogen in certain circumstances. We know neonatal meningitis, group B streptococcus is a major player. We know perinatal infections, women with vaginal colonization with group B streptococcus is a pretty scary thing. And group B streptococcus is something that loves especially diabetics and those who are significantly immunosuppressed for various reasons. So group B streptococcus, can it cause meningitis? Yes. But an adult with no reason to get group B streptococcus is a little unusual, not impossible. The good news is group B streptococcus is extremely penicillin susceptible. You do not get penicillin resistance to GBS. So when I know neuro and us, we talk, when we say GBS, we mean different things. So yeah, I think we'll all be burnt by acronym sometime or the other. So when we say GBS, we mean group B strep. So the answer here would be ceftriaxone. So let's look at it one by one. Dexamethasone. The role of dexamethasone has been proven for pneumococcal meningitis, and it has also been proven in childhood meningitis. The rest of it is extrapolated. The data for other bacteria is not as strong. It probably will make some difference. So it's reasonable to continue the ceftriaxone. Do we need meropenem? No, it is penicillin susceptible. Ceftriaxone is just as good. If you are brave enough to use crystalline penicillin, you can use benzyl penicillin as well. You definitely don't need vancomycin, and you definitely don't need acyclovir.
Sir, Subra said couple of things from my side. Why exactly do you use dexamethasone and not any other steroid in these cases of CSF meningitis?
Just because it's been validated. You can always make a case saying, why not methylpred? So I go by validation.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, I'll give you an example. In tuberculous meningitis, we do use prednisone. We use dexamethasone and then step down to prednisone. So there is nothing magical about it. You can talk about the CNS penetration and things like that. Here's my point. When we talk about CNS penetration, we are talking about intact meninges. This is not an intact meninges, this is an inflamed meninges. And in the setting of inflamed meninges, a lot of drugs get in much better than usual. So CSF penetration should not be looked at with the lens of a normal homeostasis. This is an abnormal situation. There will be leaking, and therefore whatever we give, there will be some entry irrespective of what drug we use.
Sir, and sir, one more thing. There's a practice of starting meropenem for community-acquired meningitis. Is there any role for starting meropenem for community-acquired?
No. No, the reason is that, see, why are we using vancomycin? The reason we are using vancomycin is because we are now starting to see PRP or DRSP, drug-resistant strep pneumonia or penicillin-resistant pneumococcus. We have started to see that, and the risk is highest in the pediatric age group. The current Indian data suggests that nearly 10% of the pediatric age pneumococcal meningitis is actually penicillin-resistant. Have I seen penicillin resistance in adults? Yes, I have had it. The head of my neuro service a couple of years ago, he brought in his father with altered sensorium 2 hours after he had the meal. He went to bed, 80-year-old, and then could not wake up. They thought it was a stroke. It turned out to be pneumococcal meningitis and penicillin resistant. I mean, he actually survived. But the point, long story short, please understand, penicillin resistant pneumococcal meningitis is something that's rising. That's the reason why the recommendation is for using vancomycin. If you are ceftriaxone resistant, the chance of you being meropenem susceptible is fairly slim. So your increased pickup from ceftriaxone to meropenem is actually not that great. So if you are going to combine vancomycin with ceftriaxone, the meropenem is really not going to add that much more. It's not wrong, but you will get away just as well with ceftriaxone. But the other issues about the dosing of the vancomycin. I think you've got to be extremely careful. You need to be very aggressive in dosing vancomycin. Remember, vancomycin penetration in the CNS is not brilliant. It probably is decent in inflamed meninges, but you have to dose it based on the patient's body weight and creat clearance. The first dose being a full dose. So if this guy was a big guy, if he was at least 60 kilos or adult, I would 60 kilos or over, I would go for a gram Q8, not a gram Q12.
So you like to give vancomycin as an infusion or over 1 hour?
1 hour. I don't see, the point is it's AUC by MIC, so it's very difficult predicting the kinetics. Each person's kinetics are different. So ideally, if you're using vancomycin without trough levels, you really don't know what you're doing. And there are very good calculators. So at least if you get one trough level after about 4 half-lives, just before the 5th dose, if you get one trough level, then based on that, you can correct it. And I have found that in my practice, as long as other parameters like kidney functions remain stable, it is actually quite accurate.
So last question on vancomycin before we move on. Trough levels are not available in most of our ICUs, but there are nomograms for vancomycin on the basis of the GFR. Should we use them or not use them?
You can, but remember that they do not correlate very well with your trough levels. They do not correlate well with your trough levels. It's a big problem. No, but see, in the setting that you don't have anything else, I think it makes sense, right? But my point is, as you start asking for trough levels, the service will develop. So please start asking for that. See, everything else, vancomycin can be replaced by another drug like picoplanin. This is one situation. CNS is one situation. Infection is one situation where you can't do without vancomycin. And it's still a good drug. Let's not say it's a bad drug. It's a good drug. So start asking for vanco levels. The service will automatically improve.
Thank you, sir. So Ansari sir,
only one thing, very, very aptly and very succinctly summarize the usage of vancomycin as well as steroid. Only one thing, there is a debate about, in case if you diagnose the cause of meningitis being listeria or maybe meningococcal meningitis, probably that's a condition where steroids should be discontinued. That's what a lot of schools of thought are, because continuing steroid in that situation may be harmful. Well, any opinions at this point, sir?
No, see, the thing is that intracellular organisms, you got to be careful about using steroids. That's what, see, for example, the one serious contraindication to organ donation is somebody dying of listeria meningitis, because it's an intracellular organism, it's extremely transmissible, and steroids make it far worse. So be very careful about organisms intracellular, and listeria is a killer. It will kill the recipient as well. So if it's an organ transplant, I know it's a little left wing over here, but having said that, yes, there are situations where steroids are bad. The good news is, since those organisms are fairly rare, upfront use of dexamethasone, if you're thinking of pyogenic meningitis, is absolutely reasonable. But like Dr. Ansari has pointed out, if you have one of those unusual organisms, immediately get off the steroid.
So, but at the same time, meningococcal can also cause this knockout of the adrenal gland. So one has to look at that also.
Absolutely. See, again, horses for courses. If you have a Waterhouse-Friderichsen BMAH, bilateral massive arterial hemorrhage kind of a situation, yes, replacement steroids are required. But here we are talking about dexamethasone at a much higher dose. And there you would not prefer dexamethasone, you would actually prefer hydrocortisone because it's fast-acting. So yes, there are situations where steroids need to be used. But, fortunately, meningococcus in our country seems to be fairly rare. Thank God for that. And it's a horrendous disease.
So, Dr. Ansari sir, should we move on?
Yeah, please. I'm getting in between long doubts.
Okay,
I'm
sir,
very
then
sorry
I will
for
try
that.
to, that's what I thought. No,
Please move it. Please move.
I will try to just kind of modulate. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So, as per sir, we should go with option B as per Dr. Subramaniam. So let's see what happened in our ICU. In our ICU, we stopped the acyclovir, but the meropenem, vancomycin, and the dexamethasone were continued. Patient was a low molecular weight heparin was added, and his old medication, that is the antiplatelet statins, antihypertensives, were continued. Vancomycin trough levels were sent before the 4th dose.
Prachi, why was he started on levetiracetam? Did he have a seizure?
So yes, on onset, on day one only, he had
I think
presented to
onset
us.
itself.
Yeah. So let's now just have a discussion. I think Dr. Subramaniam has already covered a lot of things, but we'll just have a discussion about the drugs which we are using as a treatment. So starting with dexamethasone in adults in bacterial meningitis. So the treatment with dexamethasone was associated with a reduction in risk of unfavorable outcome and the reduction in mortality. Among the patients with pneumococcal meningitis, there were unfavorable outcomes in 26% of the dexamethasone group as compared to 52% in the placebo group. And gastrointestinal bleeding occurred in 2 patients in the dexamethasone group and in 5 patients in the placebo group. So we can see that whenever dexamethasone should be given at the same time with the first antibiotic to attenuate cerebral inflammation caused by antibiotic mediated bacteriolysis. If pneumococcal meningitis is diagnosed, treatment with dexamethasone should be continued for 4 days, they say. And dexamethasone should be stopped in meningococcal and listerial meningitis. That already Dr. Subramanian has told us about this. So the dose of dexamethasone that has been studied is 10 mg for 6 hourly with the antibiotics, of course. So this is the dose which they say, which is actually a very high dose. But I would like if the panelists would comment regarding this dose. Anything
Dr.
regarding
Gogia, sir? Dr. Gogia, sir, are you there? Dr. Gogia, sir? He was there anyway. So, Prachi, what is your question?
Sir, regarding the dose which mostly all studies are studying a dose of 10 mg 6 hourly of dexamethasone.
So please comment your comments on the dose. Okay, I don't know what is happening.
So,
Is everybody there or was getting disconnected? Hello, is it? Hello?
yeah, so the dose is 0.15 milligrams per kg, which is to be given for 2 to 4 days.
Okay,
6.
thank you.
Yeah.
Carry on. Prachi, I think carry on, please.
And moving on to the antimicrobials, the first line therapy is dexamethasone plus ceftriaxone. If there is high likelihood of pneumococcal meningitis or recent beta-lactam use, then we add a vancomycin. So this is what actually Dr. Subramaniam has already discussed with us, that dexamethasone plus ceftriaxone and if vancomycin if there is likelihood of pneumococcal meningitis or recent beta-lactam use. If there is risk factors of listeria meningitis, then we can add benzyl penicillin. Also, this slide it shows us the therapy for patients who are penicillin hypersensitive, are allergic to penicillin. That one option. What options do we have? Like if there is severe allergic reaction, then we can switch to moxifloxacin and add vancomycin.
Carry on.
So the empirical therapy and empirical antimicrobial therapy in acute bacterial meningitis. So in adults, if we are the positive agents is strep pneumonia or Neisseria meningitis, ceftriaxone plus vancomycin. In immunocompromised, ampicillin plus ceftazidime or cefepime plus vancomycin. And if we are suspecting nosocomial meningitis with Staph aureus, Staph epidermidis, or any gram-negative bacilli, ceftazidime or cefepime or meropenem plus vancomycin. Also, I would like to just mention about the intraventricular or intrathecal antibiotics. There are some fixed indications for this. If we get a multi-drug resistant organism, and also if there is failure to clear CSF despite systemic therapy for 5 to 7 days of active therapy, and Enterococcus, Staphylococcus aureus, Pseudomonas, Klebsiella, Acinetobacter, and other MDR gram-negative organisms, then we can think about intraventricular or intrathecal antibiotics.
So actually, at this point of time, I would just like to emphasize one important thing, that there is a completely new guideline for all intraventricular and intrathecal antibiotic usage. In fact, the dosing for these approaches are very kind of complex and debatable. Here, I would want an expert opinion from Dr. Subramanian, whether he would like to kind of tell how seriously we should be kind of treating nosocomial meningitis, especially now with the Acinetobacter actually becoming very prominent for those device associated or shunt associated infections. Any thoughts about that, sir?
See, the correct answer is we don't have any correct answers. So obviously, I always look at, see, for Acinetobacter, it's so much more complicated because you really don't have great systemic options. So for other Enterobacteriaceae, if it is chloramphenicol susceptible, I always reach for chloramphenicol for quite a few reasons. One, the CNS penetration is practically 100%. And second, the biofilm penetration is incredible. So therefore, especially in the setting of indwelling hardware, chloramphenicol is a brilliant drug. Here's the problem. People are really scared of using it. My team is very generous with chloro use. We love chloro. It's a beautiful drug. For neuroinfections, you can't beat chloro. Even for typhoid, for that matter, we have used chloro for certain situations in typhoid where we don't have an option. Okay, coming back to this. So for Acinetobacter, chloro is not a great drug. You really can't get away with chloro. So you are forced to do certain jugglery. There are new drugs in the anvil, but I think those are also going to have problems. Like cefiderocol is coming out, but even that seems to be having a problem as far as Acineto is concerned, and that we will get to know more often in the days to come. Now, intrathecal or intraventricular use is probably something that we are forced to do, not because we like it, but we have no other way of getting the drug into the involved area. And obviously, between colistin and polymyxin, you need to know that colistin is not a great drug because it's a pro-drug. It has to be converted to the active moiety, and therefore it needs a lock time. On the other hand, polymyxin being the active drug, you can probably inject it directly. But here's the problem. Both of this can also induce a chemical meningitis, which can be pretty bad as well. So, it's not all rosy. You can choose which toxicity you want to go for, whether you want the infection to do bad things or whether you want the drug to do bad things. Kind of sometimes is a close call, but ethically you are justified in pushing a drug like polymyxin. But if you are doing that, always back it up with systemic therapy for whatever it's worth. I think we need more drugs. That's the basic answer. Secondary agents, again, you really don't have drugs which enter very well. Aminoglycosides, if there is a role for it, yeah, intrathecal or intraventricular could be considered. They do also have very good local activity. But again, systemic therapy doesn't really work. I remember back in the 90s, I had a nosocomial Pseudomonas meningitis where the person could not afford imipenem, because back in the late 90s, we only had imipenem. And I did intrathecal amicase injection every alternate day. And after 14 days, the patient walked home. So yes, I think aminoglycosides do have some activity, But having said that, the problem is that these things have not been very well studied, and a lot of it is case reports and personal experience. I wish somebody would just put all the data together as a database and look at what Sam Hill is happening. Maybe give some ideas on how much to dose and what to do. A lot of it is based on personal opinions and personal experiences. So I think more data needs to come out over here.
Thank you, sir, for these honest submissions. But is there any role of TG cycline? People do talk about it reaching in the CSF. And number two, is there any role for fosfomycin, obviously minus CRAB, not for Acinetobacter, for any other infection? What is your take on that?
Fosfomycin is a fly, and therefore it can literally get in everywhere. So yeah, fosfomycin sounds exciting, but Klebsiella is not the number one problem as far as nosocomial infections in the CNS is concerned. For some reason, in most institutions, it's still Acinetobacter, which is a bugbear. But yes, fosfomycin could be a backup option. Never use it as a primary therapy, mainly because drug resistance emerges very, very fast. And you need elephantine doses. A lot of dosing is homeopathic. And at that dose, you probably are not going to be able to get over it. So you need to be very, very aggressive. If you're not causing enough diarrhea in your patients, you're probably not dosing it correctly. The other, other than fosfomycin, what was the other issue? I'm sorry, train of thought.
Something about TG cycline. Is there any role
TG cycline, yes. So, a couple of years ago, my team and I, we sat and brainstormed about the CNS penetration of a lot of these doxycycline group, tetracyclines. And you know what is interesting? The drug which has the best CNS penetration is actually minocycline of the lot. But having said that, none of this can get in enough levels for us to be really sure about how effective it will be. And, for a long time, we've been beating around saying, Sidel, static, and you should be careful about using a static drug in meningitis. That's all bunkum. Chloramphenicol is a brilliant drug and it's static and it works very well. So that is not the issue. I'm more concerned about the tigecycline penetration to the CNS. I think one issue is about the way tigecycline has been dosed. Wyeth killed the drug because they were worried about the vomiting, and therefore they dosed it at a dose which really doesn't do very well. So if you're using at 100 stat and 50 Q12, you're not going to get anywhere. But at the right dose, which is probably 200 stat and 100 BD, you may get in reasonable doses in the CNS. But the problem is that it's absolutely a crapshoot because you really don't know how much you're getting into the CNS. And therefore, it would be a little worrisome. It's not impossible, but I think it's worrisome. I would not trust tigecycline as my go-to therapy, but I would use it as a backup option along with a polymyxin or something like that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for that. I think we should move on. One last word before.
Sir, I have one comment, sir, a basic comment. So this bacteriostatic and bactericidal. This is a question always in the ICU. Don't give this drug because this is bacteriostatic. Let's give a bactericidal. So please just explain to me and everybody what is bacteriostatic, bactericidal, and should we use or not use bacteriostatic, please, sir.
A few years ago, my good friend Dr. Rajiv Soman, who likes me a lot and likes to put me in extremely difficult positions, asked me to give a talk in our national conference about something like this. So I actually went through a lot of data in various circumstances. The holy grail for static versus sidal are things like endocarditis, osteomyelitis, CNS infection, and neutropenic. Honestly speaking, the only place where we have inadequate data to make the distinction is neutropenic. Everywhere else, there is actually very good data to say that the static and sidal distinction is actually bunkum. There's really no data to prove that. And in fact, there is data to say that they're equivalent. As far as CNS infections are concerned, for a very, very long time, chloramphenicol was the go-to drug for CNS infections. And honestly speaking, it was a brilliant drug. The people went away from it because we have safer options, not because they were better options, but because safer options. But chloramphenicol is a brilliant drug. So to me, I think the static versus sidal is a issue which has been blown out of proportion, and I don't give it much credence. The only situation where I'm a little concerned about it is in the neutropenic host, where the antibiotic has to do the job of killing the organism directly because the host immune system counts for nothing. Every other situation, your host immune system will be able to mop it up. As long as we stun the organism, that's good enough. The host immune system will take care of it. And remember, it's not the organism which is killing the patient. It's the immune system which is running amok, which is killing the patient. So as long as you stop the bacteria from producing all this toxic stuff, you'll be fine. And remember, that's where ICU care comes in. Your goal-directed therapy and aggressive ICU care really makes a difference. So don't get too caught up in the static versus idle. I know people keep beating the drum even today. It's BS.
Thank you, sir. So, the take-home message here, sir, would be that in neutropenic patients, and probably we can extend that to immunocompromised in other situations also, because the killing part, like you said.
Again, I have not made that distinction even in other immunosuppressed, only in prolonged profound neutropenia. So if somebody has a chemotherapy-related neutropenia, which is going to resolve very, very quickly, I don't make the distinction. I have a lot of transplant patients where I've used tigecycline as monotherapy. My liver transplant patients who have biliary sepsis, I've used tigecycline as monotherapy. I've stopped using that because tigecycline resistance has gone up. But otherwise, I'm not bothered. I've used chloramphenicol in these patients. Absolutely no problem. So no, I don't make a big deal out of it. I think the only situation where I would make a difference is in hematopoietic related prolonged profound neutropenia related sepsis. That's the only situation where I make the distinction. Outside of that, no.
Thank you, sir. So I
Thank
think,
you, sir.
friends, Ansari sir, we'll just summarize this. That
Yeah. Only one thing still needs to be addressed with the healthcare associated, kind of meningitis. One last question, sir. If despite appropriate antibiotics and doing the PKPD or optimization, a patient with an indwelling shunt or indwelling device, it is very, very difficult to convince a neurosurgeon to really go in and get the device out or resite it. What is your gold standard when you would really kind of insist upon that? Repeat CSF showing a rising count or a lactate value or a procal or something else? How do you kind of, I know for you it may not be very difficult to convince them, but for younger intensivists it may not be easy.
Don't be so sure. It's a tough call. See, I feel sorry for my surgical colleagues because telling them to go back and do this again, it kind of feels deflating to say the least. So I get what their concern is. And it's a goddamn mess to go in and do all of that. So they have my sympathies. So there are a couple of things we could think of, like lock therapy and things like that. But long story short, none of it really works very well. They invariably relapse because it's so immune protected. The host surveillance is so poor. If they don't break through immediately, they will break through on follow-up. So I tell them it's a choice. Either you do it now or you do it later. You'll just have to do it. You can choose when you want to do it, but you're going to do this. Invariably, the first time they disagree with me, 2 months later, when they have to do it again, I tell them, "Arey yaar, kar do na." So just do it. You know it's painful. I agree with you. You have my sympathies. But, nobody's a winner here. Nobody's a winner here. We are all losers. So let's just accept it, cut our losses and move on.
Yeah. Thank you. Praji, let's move on.
So as we were talking about the treatment, we started with the steroid, the antimicrobials, and also the anti-epileptics. As Dr. Bansal had pointed out at that time, that should we give prophylactic antibiotics? So there is no established role of any prophylactic anti-epileptic. So risk factors for development of seizure include pneumococcal etiology and abnormalities on imaging. And EEG must be performed to rule out non-convulsive seizures, and the choice of anti-epileptics could be fosphenytoin and levetiracetam. So if there is a seizure or any...
One question for you actually, what are the advantages of levetiracetam over all other anti-epileptics in the ICU? Why is it so commonly used now? We have stopped using almost all the other drugs. I mean, as a first-line drug, right?
Yes, sir.
So the advantages, I will just for our younger friends, one, it has very few drug interactions. It has very few drug interactions, and its toxicity is also very less. It has no hepatotoxicity, no renal toxicity. You can give a good dose as per the GFR, and the efficacy is probably the same. You cannot say what is more efficacious, what is less efficacious. It has a good efficacy. So these are some of the important features of levetiracetam, which make it the first-line drug in a usual scenario. Of course, our status is not the first line, but overall, we use it commonly. Those are the features of levetiracetam which make it very attractive to us as intensivists.
Yes.
So in fact, I would actually add over here, Dr. Prachi, are you aware of any other new, kid on the block on this anti-epileptic one? Something better or more refined version than levetiracetam? So actually, brevitrazepam has also been actually included now. So a lot of neurologists are shifting towards that. I'm not very sure of any particular advantage, but it makes it easier. Probably the drug levels are better maintained, and the kinetics are better. So it's worthwhile kind of learning about this new drug as well, because it is slowly and steadily going to replace more of the OPD, kind of usage of anti-epileptics. Please move on.
Yes, Dr. Ansari, one more thing here. I would like to add for please, when you're having seizures which are not getting controlled, which is a big problem in the ICU, just focusing back on the intensive care, please give 3 grams per day. The maximum dose of levetiracetam is 3 grams per day. Often I see, 750 BD or 500 BD going on and then giving another drug. Please maximize the dose of Levipil. It's 1.5 gram BD, 3 grams per day. Before you carry on.
I completely agree. I completely agree. In fact, 2.5 gram is the minimum dose that should be going to most of the patients in the first week. And once you have a good level, maybe if you want to really continue it longer, get the levels done, and for an average size individual without any renal or renal dysfunction. I completely agree.
So coming back to our case now, so we were on day 3 and we received the the CSF cultures, and we had a pan-sensitive culture coming to us. The blood cultures were negative, but the CSF cultures grew strep agalactiae, and it was a pan-sensitive culture. So what will we do now? So we were on meropenem, vancomycin, and dexamethasone. So what now? I think all my colleagues could just come ahead and give their opinions
Chat box,
about
please.
this.
Chat box.
So not many responses yet. I think not the fastest finger yet, but I think let's ask at this point of time, because yeah, Swapna has said that yes, she would like to de-escalate to ceftriaxone, and I would like to second that. Yuthi also says that. I think we have a couple of responses which definitely want to de-escalate and
We have to give 1
want to
minute.
de-escalate to ceftriaxone alone. So let's move on. Prachi, any comments at this point of time by any panelists, or would anybody want to differ at this point of time? Please come up. Okay, I think Prachi, we can.
Yeah, so as everybody suggests, yes, even we did the same thing. We de-escalated to ceftriaxone alone, continued dexamethasone for 4 days, but our only antimicrobial of choice was ceftriaxone, even for this case. But now on day 3, patient had a drop in GCS. It went to E2, M4, ED1, requiring intubation and ventilation in view of airway protection. Pupils were bilaterally equal to mm only, and now we shifted this patient for an MRI. The MRI here is showing leptomeningeal enhancement. No other abnormality was seen. There was just leptomeningeal enhancement. So the patient was intubated on day 3. Okay, by day 6, the patient's neurological status was improving, and by day 9, patient was weaned and extubated. On day 14 of admission, patient currently is on ceftriaxone alone. Patient had sudden development of right side weakness and fever with altered sensorium. So we had a repeat MRI and CSF studies done at this moment. Blood cultures were also sent. The CSF study now shows cells around 910 cells, which have come down from 4,000, which was on our previous CSF study. RBCs of 70, proteins coming down to 54, and CSF sugar 74. And the MRI, it is showing leptomeningeal enhancement. Also, infarct, the white marks which we can see on this diffusion image is infarcts which were seen on the MRI.
Very, very interesting thing. Yeah, at this point of time, Dr. Prachi, so this is what we classically call the deteriorating CNS patient. So whenever you have a CNS patient which is deteriorating, in any setup, you have to start thinking about an imaging, because without imaging, you really would not know what exactly is happening, and the apart from this current case where we are talking about, vasculitic infarcts or whatever, we will come to that. But the other common causes that you must rule out in these kind of high risk patients is to look for subdural empyema or intracerebral abscesses, or maybe development of some hydrocephalus or some venous sinus thrombosis. So it's very important that whenever, before we de-escalated our antibiotic based upon the CSF, we must look at the clinical picture. How is the patient doing? Is he more brisk? Is the neck more supple? Is he more alert? Has he not thrown any seizure? Because sometimes we are very, very happy to only treat the reports rather than look at the clinical parameter. And if the patient, despite having the best antibiotic and very sensitive bug, is not responding, there is something else happening in the neuropathology. Any suggestion, Dr. Subramaniam, at this point of time?
So maybe Dr. Ansari, so just not clear. He improved, got extubated again, right?
Yes, sir. On day 14. Yes, sir.
And what is showing exactly? Because I'm not very good at the MRI. There's some focal densities, right?
The infarcts were seen, and there was leptomeningeal enhancement still persisted, and there were few infarcts which were seen.
I have a quick couple of questions. How old is this patient?
67.
67. Yeah, 67.
Okay. Have you examined his cardiovascular system?
Yes, so the 2D echo is normal. I have no endocarditis, nothing.
That's important. Let's make sure it's not endocarditis if you're missing, because you're seeing multifocal infarcts over here.
Yes.
And this is not really the person that I would expect GBS. GBS is common in older people, granted, but he's not galloping away immunosuppressed that I normally see this in. So that's why I'm a little concerned. Yeah, okay. So see, my concern is this. In that, the inoculum load is an issue only when you have an inducible resistance gene. In GBS, you really don't have any inducible resistance. So if you're using an aggressive dose of ceftriaxone or meropenem, you're not going to make any difference. It is, see, I tell you, that distinction happens especially when you have gram negatives and ESBL and things like that. That's where, you make the distinction between BLBLIs and carbapenems and stuff like that. But when you have a completely penicillin susceptible organism, it doesn't matter what penicillin you use. Preferably, you use a penicillin which can be dosed very, very frequently. That's why I like benzyl penicillin, because you can give it every 2 hours. And time over MIC. With ceftriaxone, you do get very good levels, but I prefer something like benzyl penicillin because you can dose it every 2 hours, and your time over MIC is practically 24 hours. And it's fantastic that way. So that's why I'm a little old-fashioned, and I always keep hunting for benzyl penicillin to give these patients. If you're thinking of a, what should I say, loculated area where penetration is very poor, that's where drugs like chloro come in. So if you have an area where you think penetration is a problem, chloro gets in everywhere. Chloro gets in everywhere. But routinely to use chloramphenicol, I would advise against it because, it's kind of difficult defending it if the person has a bad outcome.
Would I ask, sir, over here, do you think that we all are also obsessed about steroids? Do you think steroids might reduce the penetration of the drug? I know it's very difficult, it's very theoretical, but do you think that we should probably reserve steroid for only specifically DRSP kind of pathogens?
That's difficult. See, the problem is a priori you don't know what organism it is, and the studies have shown clearly that unless you get the steroids up front, it really doesn't help you. So let's put it like this. Yes, it will harm a small percentage of patients, but if used right, it will help a huge number of patients. So the equivalent that I would do is say thrombolysis for a CVA. Yes, some people will die acutely because of the bleed, but a lot of people will survive because of the thrombolysis. So I think, yes, it's a double-edged sword, but the potential for benefit far exceeds the potential for risk. And therefore, I would still weigh in favor of giving the steroids upfront, provided antibiotics are not being used. See, I still am struggling to remember the last time I had a patient who came to my hospital without having had antibiotics on the way. Very simply put. That would be publishable.
I agree. I completely agree. Maybe poisonings. Yeah.
So here, I think I would also agree with Dr. Subra. Like, if suppose the antibiotics have been given, then steroids should not be used, because that's when they will actually decrease the penetration of the antibiotics. If steroids are given after the first dose of the antibiotic. So and plus again, the duration of DEXA is also important. It's just for 2 to 4 days. If it's a proven pneumococcal meningitis. Besides, as Dr. Subra has mentioned, like, this Streptococcus ehrlichiae belongs to the Viridans group of Streptococci. It's not a common pathogen for meningitis. I mean, not the most common pathogen.
No,
So here,
is it tubercular meningitis which is responding to steroids and getting vasculitis? What is happening if we don't think it's streptococcal aggregate? Are we dealing with TBM which has responded to dexamethasone partially and relapsing now with vasculitic influx coming in?
no. So basically, we have to look into the entire history, the initial clinical presentation plus WBC, and plus we can also use the modified Fate score to revisit our diagnosis. And this was the CSF culture which has grown this, right? CSF culture growing Streptococcus ehrlichiae.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so this can come up from like the oral, probably from the oral cavity, but definitely not the common pathogen. So probably revisit the diagnosis and then using more frequent dosing of the beta-lactams, like maybe benzyl penicillin. In my center, at times it's not very easily available. So even ampicillin-sulbactam combination will also be a good choice if it's penicillin sensitive with the MIC. I think less than 0.12 was the MIC.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So if you don't get benzyl penicillin, ampicillin is a very good option. Ampicillin is a very good option. You keep giving it every 6 hours. You can push it, try and push it even further than that. The idea is to hit it as many times as possible. The reason why I'm generally very leery about using ceftriaxone is because I don't like something being dosed only 2 times a day for a CNS infection where I want a lot of level continuously in the blood. So I'm generally unhappy. See, ceftriaxone is very highly protein bound, and in the ICU we are generally upset about using protein bound drugs, right? We don't want something which is excessively protein bound. We want lots of it being free. So I prefer something which needs to be dosed more frequently. It's a pain in the whatever, but I think it's worthwhile.
Dr. Bachi, please carry on.
Yeah. So the MRI showed a leptomeningeal enhancement, and in fact, patient was already on antiplatelets and was on anticoagulations, which were continued. So I just want to mention here one study which was done about role of repeat CSF in bacterial meningitis. So repeat lumbar puncture is performed in a small proportion of adults. Also, it should not be done as a routine. It can be useful in selected cases to confirm diagnosis, to exclude relapsing or persistent infection, or for therapeutic purpose for communicating hydrocephalus, because we've done a repeat lumbar puncture here. So I just wanted to quote this study that it should be done only if we want a confirmation of the diagnosis, exclude relapsing or persistent infections, and for therapeutic purpose in communicating hydrocephalus. So now when we
Dr. Prachi, one thing I'd like to add.
Yes.
How do you assess the repeat culture? You do the repeat CSF analysis when the patient is not improving generally like you showed. So the first thing that would improve in at least bacterial meningitis would be your sugars. Your blood sugars would start improving,
Right.
proteins, and then your cells. This is the sequence. So the first thing to look at is your blood sugar improvement, right? That is how you. That is the way you use a repeat CSF to see whether the patient is responding in terms of your antibiotics.
So as the patient had fever and had neurodeterioration, patient was started on vancomycin and meropenem. The antiplatelets were continued. Patient became afebrile after 48 hours after change of this regimen. The CSF and blood cultures did not grow any organism. There was marked improvement in the neurological status, aggressive physiotherapy, and neurorehabilitation was done. Vancomycin was given for 14 days with sending the trough levels, and meropenem for 21 days. Patient was symptom free and discharged on day 28 with no focal neurological deficits. So this brings us to the end of our case.
So, Dr. Praju, what was his finally the final kind of recovery profile? how was his overall neurological recovery? You think that he had no neurological dysfunction, or there was some kind of residual involvement about the weakness of the extremities?
No, sir. The patient went home walking, so there was no focal neurological deficit. But he had a prolonged stay in the hospital because of the prolonged antibiotics which were given.
Please tell
I'm
me.
not sure, but it looked. Yeah, sorry,
No,
somebody.
no, please go on. No, no, Dr. Ansari, please go on.
I think I would retrospectively look at this as probably the quorum effect or the burden of the disease itself probably was so bad that this gentleman probably took a prolonged time, and whatever transient improvement was not sustained, and he needed a better airway, breathing, circulation control all throughout his neurological recovery before we would have pushed the kind of the ball into the hands of the immune system to really take it over. Over to you, Dr.
One comment though. I'm
Yes.
hoping you gave both the flu and the pneumococcal vaccine at discharge. You don't want to come back with another meningitis.
Yes, I will be talking about the vaccination also. Yes, sir.
Thank you. No, no, please understand it's something which is very close to me, and
Yes,
therefore I'm
yes,
very
sir.
passionate about it. Yeah.
So one more thing which we want to talk about here is the prognostic markers when the patient comes to us. So how we can prognosticate that how we are going to discharge this patient. There have been various studies which have been done about the prognostic markers in bacterial meningitis. And as a summary of these studies, these are the factors which are risk factors for an unfavorable outcome: advanced age, presence of otitis or sinusitis, a low score on the or GCS on admission, positive blood cultures, elevated ESR, thrombocytopenia, low CSF WBC count, alcoholism, cranial nerve palsy, and high serum C-reactive protein concentration. Like both the studies recommend almost the same factors which point out toward a unfavorable outcome. Also, some studies have been done regarding this 4 score. Like there are some institute which are preferring this score more than the Glasgow Coma Scale. So the 4 score is basically a full outline score of unresponsiveness, which in prediction of outcome in patients with severe meningitis. So this score has 5 for eye opening, 5 points for motor response, pupillary response, and breathing. So there is also there are brainstem reflexes and respiration status which have been included in this score, and which the lower the score, the unfavorable the outcome for this patient. I don't think if is anybody using this score in their
In fact, 4 score
setup.
traumatic brain injury has also been seen in a lot of emergency studies, and I think because of the inclusion of brainstem reflexes, it also gives you a better idea, and the breathing pattern. So I think it definitely GCS is very well documented and used in all kind of CNS pathologies, but specifically trauma and probably infections. 4 score is getting more and more popular, I would say.
Yes, Dr. Alzani, absolutely, I agree. 4 score compared to GCS, 4 score, like you said, gives a more detailed examination of the brainstem. But at the same time, it's a little plus minus because GCS has been used for a very long time. So it is not being replaced by 4 score as far as our place is concerned. That's a problem. But like you rightly said, 4 score is a more detailed and a more extensive examination of the coma, the patient.
So moving on to primary prevention, Prachi. Yeah.
So the epidemiology and vaccination, the epidemiology of community-acquired bacterial meningitis worldwide has changed in the past decades as a result of the introduction of conjugated vaccines against influenza, meningitis, serogroup, and 13-valent pneumococcal conjugate vaccines. This resulted in a dramatic reduction in the incidence of bacterial meningitis in children, and currently the majority of patients are adults. Adults should receive a meningococcal vaccine if they have complement deficiency, have functional and anatomic asplenia, are living with HIV. They are microbiologists who are routinely exposed to Neisseria and a part of a population increased risk because of meningococcal disease outbreak.
Any suggestions, Dr. Subramaniam, please, from your side?
Sorry. Yes, in that meningococcal vaccine in our country is something that has been plagued by poor uptake. But yes, for at least for specific groups like what she said, complement deficiency and asplenia, I would definitely consider using the meningococcal vaccine. Pneumococcal vaccine, yes, clearly the vaccines have made a difference in reducing infections. And here's the point that people miss. Now there is an increased risk of drug-resistant pneumococcal meningitis, and those are the serotypes which are specifically covered in the vaccine. Things which are more likely to be drug resistant are the ones which are better covered in the vaccine, and therefore taking the vaccine not only protects against pneumococcal meningitis, it also gives you very good protection against the drug resistant pneumococcal meningitis. And one of the risk factors for bad outcomes is also penicillin resistance. If your organism is penicillin resistance, bad outcomes are much higher. That's an independent prognostic factor. So yes, it's not just about protection against meningitis, it's also protection against bad outcomes in meningitis.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
We've almost,
Prachi, are we
yes,
getting towards the end of our presentation?
yes, sir. We are almost towards the end of the presentation. We would like to have
Sir,
any questions from the
Sir, there is
audience.
one more case after this, right?
No, sir.
No, Dr. Tapesh, we initially thought that we will add one more case, but we thought that in the interest of time and discussion,
Okay.
we should not overload it. So
Okay,
I think now we can
right.
open
So
up the discussion. Yeah.
So we'll just put the question, sir. Just go back to the extubation, the neurology. Prachi, can you just tell us about the extubation? How did you extubate? What criteria did you use? Extubation. Let's just talk a little bit about neurology extubation.
So basically, sir, from day 3, the patient got intubated, and so he was sedated for 24 hours. After he became afebrile, we started giving him sedation holidays and assessing the GCS on a daily basis on giving the sedation holiday. And at this point, once the GCS had improved and there were minimal secretions, because we have to also consider that the patient should not develop any infections or VAP after being on the ventilator. So as there was neurological improvement, and there were no secretions, we started giving spontaneous breathing trials, and from day 7 onwards. And then as
So I think Dr. Prachi, what Dr. Tapesh is trying to ask is that at the time of for any neurological patient, is there any special precaution that you take as compared to any other patient who probably came with pulmonary edema? So let's say if I have a person who has been intubated with hypoxia and severe pulmonary edema, which gets cleared off after 3 to 4 days, and you are ready to extubate him, versus a person who came with seizure, trauma, or meningitis, or any CNS pathology or acute CNS dysfunction. And we'll talk about acute CNS dysfunction as an entity also. But saying that the patient had acute CNS dysfunction, got ventilated, and is now doing well by your usual criteria, and you are ready to extubate, what?
Hello. I think
Extra.
Yeah, you've got disconnected. So I will just take on from here, friends, unless Dr. Ansari joins. So let us, sir, if you join in, you can please communicate because your connection has got broken. Friends,
No, please go ahead, Dr. Tapesh. Yeah, please go.
So friends, this is just to come back to hardcore critical care in terms of extubation in neurology patients. Now, you see, the neurology patients are a different subset because one, the respiration is depressed. And the commonest cause of depression of respiration in these patients is the disease they are emerging from. So the brain has been diseased, whatever the cause, so they tend to hyperventilate. When they tend to hyperventilate, they have low oxygen levels and high carbon dioxide, which is not acceptable, one. Second, when your brain is recovering from a disease, unless it is in a very good shape, which is not when you try to extubate, their secretions are not cleared. Their secretions are not cleared. The commonest cause of reintubation in any patient is airway secretions pooling again after extubation. So they have a tendency for that. And that is because the mechanism of clearance of airway secretion comes from the brain. The ciliary movement, the swallowing reflex is all dependent on the CNS. So they tend to retain secretions. So therefore, these patients are very vulnerable to reintubation, and one has to be very careful in extubating these patients. So what are the criteria for extubating a patient who is recovering from a neurology disease? One, that he should have a clear sensorium and following commands. Second, there should be minimal suctioning. What is minimal suctioning or acceptable suctioning for neurology patients or any patient is less than 2 hourly. Less secretions or acceptable secretions for extubation is less than 2 hourly suction. Then third, he should have a good cough reflex. What is the definition of a good cough reflex? What is a good cough reflex or a good cough effort? There is no definition. A good cough effort is subjective. There is no parameter, so that's it. A good cough reflex, a clear sensorium, and having minimal secretions, and the disease should have cleared. So these patients are extubatable. One. Secondly, we come to another group which is kind of vegetative or not recovering, where the GCS will never return to normal, right? And here we can do a trick, but sometimes we don't do a trick. Sometimes we have to go in for a trial of extubation. So how do we manage these patients who do not want tracheostomy, or whom we want to consider a trial of extubation? So here a GCS of less than 8 is taken as a cutoff, and with patients less than GCS of 8, it is very risky to actually extubate them, but with consent, you can try and extubate these patients, the cutoff being taken as a GCS of 8. And you take a consent and try to extubate, provided again secretions are manageable, there is some cough reflex, and there is minimal response in some way, and then you kind of you extubate, and if required, reintubate and do a tracheostomy. So a little bit about extubation in neurology patients. Anyone, sir? Dr. Ansari, sir, you want to add to that? Any questions, any comments from anybody? So, Dr. Ansari, sir, are you there, or are you disconnected? Neha ma'am, Dr. Neha ma'am.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Tapesh. Are you asking me?
Yeah. Please summarize a little for our young intensivist from the neuro point, about meningitis, the basics. There's a few words from your side for all of us.
Yeah, to summarize, basically, we must first of all see whether it's acute or chronic meningitis. So emphasis should be given to the history, and we must draw blood cultures before giving the antibiotics. Again, if it's acute meningitis, give 1 shot of Dexa 10 to 20 minutes prior to the first dose of antibiotic, and subsequently 2 to 4 days, depending upon the etiology. And I think the antibiotics should be used in the right dosages and for the right duration. And again, the empirical therapy for acute meningitis currently would be ceftriaxone with vancomycin, because of the increasing ceftriaxone resistance among Streptococcus pneumoniae, not for the Staph aureus, because that's not really the cause for, that's not a common cause of meningitis in our scenario. And always rule out possibility of TB meningitis. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Neha. And Subramaniam, sir, can you just summarize again for us, for our young intensivists and our students in critical care, some golden words from you for CNS infections, sir?
CNS infections are amongst the most difficult areas in infectious disease, because it's not as straightforward as people think it to be. Yes, meningitis is probably the easiest part of CNS infections. The other areas of CNS infections are far more complicated and far more difficult, but diagnostics are improving. The most important thing, like Neha pointed out, is history. Try and figure out what the syndrome is and go from there. Use radiology and other features very carefully, because it may lie to you, because not because they are bad tests, but because it is not the right time to do a scan. If you do a scan too early, you may not find typical changes. If you do it too late, you might find so many complications in it that it's not clear what it is. So be very careful about all those things. Diagnostics, when you do it, like was beautifully presented by Dr. Kulkarni, depending on where you are when you do the test, again, the CSF can change. So please remember that. Remember that you need to factor in prior antibiotic exposure and things like that when you make decisions. Always ask for a lot of tests and save samples over. When you do a lumbar puncture, never take like 2 ml of fluid and say what to do with this. You're literally begging after that. The best thing to do is take a good amount of sample, save some, and then do it judiciously. Look at your counts, look at your sugar protein, and then go from there as to what all you want to do. Use molecular tests with a smart acumen on how to do this. Remember that the BioFire panel was prepared for a Western audience, so it does not include pathogens which are of concern to us, like group B, Japanese V encephalitis and things like that. So not everything is covered, but that's okay. It's still a good test. But remember, it's not 100% perfect. So always back your clinical judgment, and the more you see, the better you get. So over time, you will get better, and this is where mentorship helps. You have really great people mentoring you. Learn from their wisdom.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. And I would just like to add one more suggestion, that there is something called as a tiered approach towards dealing with all these CNS infection. I know these are all Western approaches, but sometimes, as you rightly said, you need to have those samples to look for them. Would you please, kind of enlighten the audience that what is meant by the tiered approaches, where the basic infections come first and then the more rarer and the rare possibilities that you should think in an algorithmic fashion, sir?
The point is that my boss always used to tell me, if you make a rare diagnosis, you are rarely right. So remember that, and have a algorithm in your mind. At least have an algorithm as to how you're going to approach a given syndrome. When you talk about community-acquired meningitis, Dr. Kulkarni put up this nice table about what are the usual pathogens seen in every circumstance. Also, when you see nosocomial infections, match it against your own hospital epidemiology and try and figure out what is common. And remember that you need to cover for the most common organisms, with the understanding that there will always be a curveball which comes in, but that should not be a reason for you to change your protocols just because of one issue. And when you don't see a person responding, ask yourself the following questions. I always ask only 3 questions. 1, is the diagnosis correct? 2, is the treatment correct? Meaning in terms of dosing, how frequently you're dosing, whether the strength is correct, and things like that. And 3rd, is there a complication? It can't be anything other than this. It's either a diagnosis missed, the treatment is missed, or there's a complication. So even with the right treatment, if there is a complication like an empyema, yes, you will have a person not improving. So think of the more common things first and then go about it. Always remember the host. See, that's something people miss. When you have a person who's significantly immunosuppressed, like Dr. Kulkarni put up, in a severely immunocompromised host, somebody who's received rituximab or somebody who's on profound neutropenia, the differentials definitely are very, very different. And the usual rules may not apply, and you may need a broader, a bigger net to kind of catch what happens. There are always curveballs which come in. Look at epidemiological exposures. The last time in SIDSCOT, we had a patient with hemorrhagic meningitis. It turned out to be anthrax meningitis. So you will get curveballs, but you should not be thinking of anthrax meningitis as your first diagnosis when a person comes in from the community. So look at, examine the patient from head to foot. Always look at what else is happening. If you see skin lesions, those could be tip-offs as to what is happening. So I think a tiered approach, looking at it, point by point, generating a differential at every point, and then asking questions relevant to that would be the best way of doing it. There is no one size fits all. That's the sad news. But here's the good news. It basically means we cannot be replaced by a computer at least in the immediate future. Good news. We still have to think, and the system needs us to think, and therefore we will always remain relevant, which I think is a good thing.
Thank you, sir, for summing up everything. Over to you, Dr. Tapesh. Is there anything?
Yes, sir, I will just take 5 minutes because we have a large audience and everybody's, Dr. Swaminathan, the time he has paid, we have to take some time. It's a valuable time. Sir, Dr. Swaminathan, sir, just a few questions for everybody and for myself. One, just switching to viral encephalitis. Can you have viral meningoencephalitis, which is acellular?
Okay, my boss taught me that the diagnosis of meningitis is
Sir, we can't hear you. Please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you, sir.
Okay, my Bluetooth was malfunctioning. Okay, so my boss taught me that a meningitis is defined by an abnormal CSF presentation. Anything in which the CSF is abnormal is a meningitis, and be very careful. So if you have a low sugar, think whether it's a meningitis. If you have even one neutrophil in the CSF, that's still abnormal unless there is blood contamination. The only meningitis where the CSF examination can be completely normal is cryptococcal meningitis and advanced HIV, where the CSF can be completely normal. Every parameter can be normal, but the CSF will be loaded with cryptococcal. Outside of that, practically every other meningitis will have some abnormality or the other. So, basically what it tells us is that the CSF is the gold. You have to get CSF and you need to test it and you need to do it systematically for you to make a diagnosis. Now, I think, Tapesh, your question was, can a CSF be normal in the setting of meningitis?
No, sir, my question is, sir, in viral, sir, little perturbation in glucose or protein cannot be taken as a diagnosis of inflammation of the meninges. So in viral encephalitis, I mean, the most important thing, I guess, at the end of the day is cells, unless your proteins or sugars are grossly disturbed. So can you have a viral meningoencephalitis with a cell count of less than 5?
Okay. A viral encephalitis, yes. So remember that most viral encephalitis are meningoencephalitis. But remember, you can't have a viral encephalitis without a meningitis. So if you have a person who presented with an encephalitis-like syndrome, a completely normal CSF does not exclude the possibility of a viral encephalitis. So if you have, say, something like Japanese B encephalitis, and your CSF is completely normal, you still haven't excluded that as a possibility. A PCR may be able to pick it up, but that's one of the things that's a problem. See, the problem is that viral meningeal disease, or meningoencephalitis or CNS disease, there are very few of them which are actually treatable with antivirals. Herpes viridae being the best example of it. Most of them, the treatment is supportive. That's the reason why we don't make a big deal of it, and we have not invested in diagnostics for it. Right? If we had specific treatment for it, then we would go hammer and tongs in trying to identify the actual problem and trying to fix it accordingly. Because only herpes viridae can be treated, we don't make a distinction. But yes, a viral encephalitis can have practically a normal CSF, so that is a bit of an Achilles heel.
Thank you, sir. So then, just talking about the etiology of encephalitis, viral encephalitis, and meningoencephalitis, you have been seeing so many. Which you think is the commonest cause of viral encephalitis in India, the virus?
Yeah, I like you because you're trying to get me into trouble.
No, not at all. No, come on, sir. No, we all, sir, I'll just explain this to you. The herpes simplex virus is coated all over, but we
right.
I mean, you have seen from your experience.
No question. See, the way we differentiate, actually, herpes viridae cause meningoencephalitis throughout the year. So if you have it at any time of the year, it could be herpes. Herpes can happen anytime. But generally speaking, most of your meningoencephalitis, which are seasonal, all your arboviruses and other things, they generally happen during the monsoons. That's when you have the peak. So if you have viral meningoencephalitis in January, the odds of it being herpes viridae is extremely high. On the other hand, if you have a meningoencephalitis in July, August, then the probability of it being arboviral or something like that is much higher, but you can't exclude herpes. That's the general dictum. But again, take it with a pinch of salt, because India is such a diverse country. When the monsoon for each part of India is extremely difficult to predict, right? It's like flu season. When flu season is for me and when flu season is for you is very different. So take that with a pinch of salt. For the most part, for most of you, when you see meningoencephalitis in January or February, think of herpes first. We are seeing it in June, July. Think of other viral encephalitis, including Jap B and things like that.
Okay, sir, just 5 minutes more. We'll just stop the share screen, beta. Prachi, just stop your sharing. Right, sir.
So globally, enterovirus and HSV also are definitely on the top rankers. But
Yes.
Only just one interesting thing I would like to add over here. Just very, very rarely, as Dr. Subramaniam said, rare things are rarer. but still eosinophilic meningitis is also one of the causes that should be kept in mind, especially in the light of a peripheral eosinophilia. And that's something which is important. And sometimes sterile CSF also doesn't rule out a viral meningoencephalitis, as was pointed out. And aseptic meningitis should also be kept in mind.
At the same time,
Sorry, go on.
At the same time, for my young friends here, audience, one thing, please, a normal MRI does not rule out meningoencephalitis. Please, all the time, MRI is normal, sir, there is no meningoencephalitis. Even herpes encephalitis, which is classic, 10% is not MRI, 10%. Yeah. And there is no diagnostic feature of any MRI for encephalitis. Right, guys? So a normal CSF, like sir said, and a normal MRI does not rule out meningoencephalitis. One, probability is less. But okay, so please.
Yeah. See, CNS, that's why CNS infections are so challenging. CNS infections beyond meningitis are so challenging. Making a diagnosis is very, very challenging. I know my colleagues in CMC actually ran a 2-day CME program on just neuroinfections. I sent both my fellows to it. They came back very satisfied, saying, we've learned a lot. I said, can you use it in clinical practice? I don't know what I'm going to do with it. The point is that you may have all the yarn, but I'll tell you, it takes years of experience for that yarn to mature and be usable in a clinical practice setting. You need to keep asking questions. You need to reach out to your seniors and ask them, have you seen this? What did you do? And I think that's the only way to go. There is no single way or easy way of fixing neuroinfection problem. It's a very, very complicated issue. And one more thing, non-infectious mimics, IgG4 meningitis and things like that. Oh, yeah. Problem is there are other conditions, like ocasionomatous meningitis or a subarachnoid hemorrhage due to, I don't know, say any number of reasons. A lot of things can happen which can mimic a meningitis, and you got to be extremely careful. So just because you see a CSF abnormality does not mean it's a meningitis. Ask yourself what else it could be.
Okay. Sir,
a word about just a word about how to correlate with the RBCs and white cells in the CSF for the beginners. Well, what is your rule of thumb for those people where there are definitely a traumatic kind of a tab, and that is always confusing for most of the adults. Yeah.
Okay. So because when you have a traumatic tap, you don't know whether it's a hemorrhagic CSF or whether it's a traumatic tap. Simply put, always get 4 bottles. If you've got a traumatic tap, send both the first and the last bottles for counts. And if you see a change in between the bottles, you know that's a traumatic tap. The second thing is look at how the RBC are. If the RBC look nice and beautiful, that's more likely to be a traumatic tap. RBC which have stayed in the fluid for a long time, they undergo a lot of changes and they look pretty sad. So you will see that difference. And also a clinical picture, obviously you need to correlate with it. And also look at the other CSF abnormalities and whether those things like low glucose, especially with the traumatic tap, there's no way you'll get a low glucose. Your glucose would have been taken care of by the blood in it. So always look at all those things. If sugar is low and there are RBC, that is bad news. Truly hemorrhagic meningitis, there are very few causes. Herpes viridae, anthrax, carcinomatous meningitis, subarachnoid hemorrhage due to any other reason. There are very few issues like that which cause a truly hemorrhagic CSF. So you always have to be very careful and ask those questions, and always talk to the person who did the CSF analysis. Go back and talk to them. Talk to your colleague and ask them. And see, please understand these things happen. I remember when I was doing my fellowship, they called me from the rehab institute and said, we got a patient here post-neurosurgical and this CSF has now been reported as growing coagulase negative staph. And he has some indwelling hardware. I drove in the middle of a blinding blizzard thinking, oh my God, this guy has got a meningitis and he's sitting in the rehabilitation institute. Oh my God, he's a dead duck. I go there and then I call a lot of people trying to figure out what it is. And finally, I called the neurosurgical resident who sent off the fluid before transferring over to rehab. And then he said, oh, there was some subcutaneous fluid collection. I don't know what to call it. So I just ticked off CSF and sent it off. He had to learn some choice words in various Indian languages before the conversation was over, because, driving down in a blinding blizzard to find out that it was just some tissue fluid, which is of no consequence. It's not fun. But remember, a lot of things can be clarified by asking the right questions to the right people. Ask those questions, clarify those issues so that you know what you're dealing with. Otherwise, in computer language, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out.
That's very rightly said, sir. So, sir, any questions, sir, from audience? We are going to, sir, Subramaniam, sir, anything? Oh, I mean, sorry.
No, I think it was fantastic. I loved it. I loved it. I loved it.
Ansari sir. Ansari sir.
No. See, as ID, the one thing that we always keep pushing is always try and get a diagnosis. Know what you're dealing with, because 9/10 of the time, the problem is with the diagnosis. If you don't have an accurate diagnosis, then errors increase. If you have a diagnosis, then error immediately starts falling down, because you now know what the agents are. You may have a mistake in the treatment agent or the dose and things like that. But the probability of all those things starts coming down once the diagnosis is correct. So try and always push for a diagnosis, get good volumes of CSF. Do not be stingy about it. Cutting down on the volume of CSF didn't help anybody. Definitely it doesn't help the patient. And nobody's going to die of donating some CSF. You're anyway doing the fluid. So be generous, just hydrate the patient well so that they don't have a headache. And remember, nobody's going to die of a post CSF headache, unless of course they've got very high intracranial pressures and non-communicative pressures. So don't worry about it. Get fluid, get the right analysis, save some sample, do systematically, and ask for help.
Sir, just talking about the diagnosis, now that we are using PCR, we are picking up more and more viruses. And as we pick up these viruses, we have for HSV and we have for SCMV, but we have more viruses coming up like rhinovirus and stuff like that. And there are no clear-cut guidelines, but there are anecdotal reports which show which different drugs acting in different viruses. I mean, recently there was a report in NEJM 1 year ago where they treated adenovirus CNS infection which disseminated with field, and that patient recovered. So as we get these reports, I think you must be seeing, because you are the real expert, we get these viruses sometimes in the CSF, which we think would be causing the meningoencephalitis. We should try these drugs, the antivirals, with anecdotal reports, or which are supposed to work against these viruses at the risk of toxicity also.
Dr. Bansal, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of your question. The audio got cut off.
Sir, I'm saying, like you were saying about the diagnosis, as we continue to evolve and with the PCR technique continuing to evolve, we are getting more and more viruses, right? We will get, and we are getting. And there are no real reports for antiviral in terms of studies, etc. But we know certain viruses respond to certain weekly. And as we continue to grow, sir, I think we are going to pick up more and more viruses with the PCR. We already are doing. So should we use these drugs, sir, which also have high toxicity for these, because we are going to see more of these viruses?
Absolutely. See, the problem is that having an activity against a particular agent does not necessarily translate into better outcomes. For herpes viridae, that's clear. If you have HSV or VZV, meningoencephalitis, if you start acyclovir fairly early, it makes a difference. But if you delay it, it's going to be bad no matter what you do. So yes, in certain viruses, it's been proven to make a difference. But for other viruses, you got to be very careful, because there is also an immune-mediated injury. And that, once it gets triggered, no matter what you do to the virus, there's really not much you can do. I'll give you an example. For COVID, at least, remdesivir has not been shown to improve outcomes because it's an immune-mediated injury. And once the coronavirus takes off, the lung injury is going to happen no matter what you do. So that's why it doesn't make a difference to outcomes in terms of mortality. None of the studies have shown that. So I think, yes, our viral therapeutics have been fairly limited. And here's the point. For most viral meningoencephalitis, the outcomes are actually quite good. Very few people require long-term help, and very few people die outside of herpes viridae. And the attack rate is so low that the number of people affected by it is fairly low. And finally, you can control these diseases without medicines. A lot of this has been eradicated in various parts of the world by good public health. And that's the answer. Honestly, I don't think we can improve viral therapeutics to kind of rise to the position. I think we need to look at public health to reduce the burden of these diseases and therefore get over it. See, JAPI, for example, there are some places which have lots of, Japanese encephalitis burden. And there are parts of the country where the burden is very, very, very low. And that's because of public health. So we need to focus on that. And I don't think therapeutics are the way forward. And again, you're talking about diminishing numbers. And for the pharma team, at least, it's not a high payoff area. And for that reason, nobody's going to invest in it in terms of developing new molecules for it. They may repurpose existing molecules for it, but I don't see viral therapeutics coming up in a big way, at least in the conceivable future. All the attention is on HIV, hepatitis C, and things like that. Not much outside of it, maybe CMV. outside of it, I'm sorry, I don't see therapeutics being a big option for us.
Sir, thank you. So, Ansari sir, I think, friends, if any questions now? Okay, so I don't think there are any questions. I would like to, thank personally Dr. Swaminathan sir. Dr. Swaminathan, thank you, sir. We take inspiration from you and all the young participants you have heard golden words in infectious diseases from our leading exponents in infectious disease. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for sparing 2 hours of your precious time. I'll hand it over to you,
My
Dr.
pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Tapesh. First of all, I must say that this is a wonderful platform, Young India Intensivists. I think this is really an excellent platform for having healthy, open discussions for all day-to-day problems. And I think we should keep on inviting experts in these areas so that we all can learn, brush ourselves, and remember that knowledge is progressing faster than all of us can probably comprehend and catch up. So thank you very much, and thank you, Prachi, for a wonderful case presentation. Thank you, Minal, for helping Prachi prepare the slides and guide her, and all the participants. And thank you, Dr. Tapesh, wonderfully executed. And thank you, Dr. Subramanian, once more for having such an interactive session. Thank you very much.
Dr. Prachi, thank you very much. You said you have some questions. I hope your questions were cleared.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, because you have a
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Miller ma'am. Thank you very much for guiding her. Thank you very much. Thank you, Neha. Are you there?
Yeah, Dr. Tapesh, I'm
Yeah,
here.
because your video is not, so I can't be there, can't make up. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Neha.
Yeah.
We are always obliged to you.
Thank you, Dr.
Yeah.
Neha. Sorry, I could not, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Kogia sir is not there, I think. Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you, guys. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.